This episode contains audio and descriptions depicting violence, as well as some harsh language. Please take care when listening.
The story that's ignited fierce passions across the nation. It's caused a public outcry that spread like wildfire.
At the dawn of President Obama's second term, America entered a period of reckoning. It began with the 2012 death of a Florida teen named Trayvon Martin. Martin had been walking home when he was profiled and stopped at gunpoint by a neighborhood watchman named George Zimmerman.
Trayvon Martin was shot down by a white neighborhood watchman who claimed self-defense.
Zimmerman was acquitted in 2013, igniting massive protests across the country.
Our son is your son.
Yeah.
I want you guys to stand up for justice and stand up for what's right.
People from all walks of life turned out in droves.
I see black faces. I see white faces. I see unity. More importantly, I see America.
The Black Lives Matter movement was born from this moment, and in the coming years would grow to be one of the largest civil rights movements in history. And this reckoning over racial injustice was covered extensively by the 24-hour news cycle.
Investigation into what really happened the night 17-year-old Trayvon Martin.
There is this dynamic at play here that has now come to the surface as a result of the Trayvon Martin case.
Many African-American men who see themselves as Trayvon Martin.
It was a moment that even drew comment from the president.
This could have been my son. Trayvon Martin could have been me.
National attention was finally being paid to aspects of American life that had gone ignored for decades. Discrimination, racism, and police brutality toward people of color. America was awake to a serious problem. But for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction.
There is no question that the American media is not reporting the black-white crime situation accurately.
As violence against black people gained worldwide attention, right-wing media gave its audience an alternative set of facts.
Anytime there's interracial crime, there's an overwhelming chance that the victim is going to be white.
The truth is that black men are not being hunted down by whites.
Media coverage of the Trayvon Martin case split America along party lines, and the so-called mainstream media wasn't doing itself any favors. A scandal broke that NBC News had edited the Zimmerman 911 call to make him seem racist.
NBC had aired an edited version of Zimmerman's call, trimmed to suggest that Zimmerman volunteered that Martin was black.
In all the confusion and disinformation, people started to turn to the internet to do their own research.
You had a lot of disillusioned young people looking online for meaning.
This is Joan Donovan, research director at the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard. Joan says that after the Trayvon Martin case, young people took to anonymous, unmoderated internet forums like 4chan to voice their opinions. And in a backlash against the growing social justice movement, internet trolls, users who post insincere and vile things to provoke a response, started to dominate the conversation.
There was a lot of racial animus and racism about Trayvon Martin, memes about Trayvon Martin that trolls would use in order to own the libs, as you would say.
Trolls would go back and forth with each other, posting increasingly racist content. At first, it didn't seem like much more than screaming obscenities into the void of the internet. But soon, the line between jokes and sincerity started to blur.
You start to see this ideology develop around anti-blackness, around misogyny, that some actual white supremacists who are organized decided to take advantage of. They started to go onto these message boards and answer and be responsive to people's questions about race and about gender, and tell people that if they wanted to have more discussion like that, they should move over to this other message board.
And just like that, online message boards like Reddit and 4chan became fertile recruiting grounds for the white power movement. One of the people who frequented the forums of 4chan was a young man named Dylan Roof.
Dylan Roof was by all means a fairly isolated young man who had often looked at the internet for political points of view. And in reading about Trayvon Martin, he had come across this key phrase of black on white crime.
Through these racism-infested internet forums, Roof followed links to the external websites of hate groups that had been around for decades. He ended up scrolling a website for a group called the Council of Conservative Citizens, a white separatist group that had been around since 1985.
The materials on this website hyper-focused in on what scholars in our field call hate facts. FBI statistics that can be used to move someone's political or ideological position on race.
The Council of Conservative Citizens had amassed hundreds of incidents of black-on-white assault and murder. The website didn't mention that most murders of whites, by far, were committed by other whites. But that didn't matter. Roof later claimed that as he read the grisly details, it changed him.
Dylan Roof wrote about that moment as he would not be the same after looking at statistics on black-on-white crime.
2 years after the murder of Trayvon Martin, America's racial reckoning continued.
Growing outrage tonight after an unarmed African-American teenager was shot and killed by police.
The 2014 killings of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and Eric Garner in New York touched off massive protests and civil unrest.
This is video from the night of gunfire, arson, and looting that exploded on the streets of the St. Louis suburb.
In the face of the riots, there was a growing sense on the far right that something had to be done.
In Ferguson, Missouri, one armed group known as the Oath Keepers has appeared on rooftop patrols, armed, to try to protect private property.
The militia group, the Oath Keepers, fresh off that standoff at the Bundy Ranch, showed up in Ferguson. The sudden, alarming images of white men standing by the protests with assault rifles spread across the world. And not long after, Oath Keepers member John Kerriman was praised in a segment on Fox News.
Well, why'd you do it?
That's what we do. While others run from danger, we run into it. That's how we're wired.
If indeed you are stopped from doing what you're wired to do to help others, what will be the result, John?
We won't stop.
Meanwhile, as protests brought attention to police brutality, the far-right movement was growing online, and Dylan Roof was sinking deeper into it.
He started looking into and posting on Stormfront, which was another white supremacist message board that is pretty much as old as the internet itself.
Stormfront is one of the oldest white supremacy websites, dating back to 1995. It may have been there that Roof educated himself on all the old tropes of white supremacy, that other races were inferior and violent, that white people needed to overthrow the government and create their own country.
With Dylan Roof, he wasn't radicalized by joining a group of people. He was radicalized doing his own research through the internet.
Dating back to the Turner Diaries, white supremacists believed that the only way to achieve their goal of an all-white world was to spark a war among the races. And if you were watching the news in 2015, like Dylan Roof, it might have seemed that America was on the brink of one.
Baltimore is burning. After a day of looting and rioters clashing violently with police, tonight a community center in flames.
The police killing of Freddie Gray in Baltimore touched off civil unrest and riots.
Rioters armed with gas masks, appearing ready for a fight. The police force under siege.
Donald Trump, who was mulling a run for president, weighed in on Twitter, calling the mostly black protesters thugs who were happily and openly destroying Baltimore. And that message resonated with a growing group of white people. Dylan Roof ranted about the Freddie Gray riots over drinks with a friend. He said black people were taking over the world, and that someone needed to do something about it for the white race.
In looking at this content day in and day out, looking at these rabbit holes and trying to understand what could be done about, in his mind, the scourge of blackness in the U.S., he then believed that he was the only one who could potentially spark other people or inspire other people. He crafted a plan he believed would kick off a race war.
That is some group of people, thousands.
On June 16, 2015, Donald Trump descended that golden escalator at Trump Tower to announce his candidacy in a speech full of racist invective.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. The American dream is dead. But if I get elected president, I will bring it back, and we will make America great again. Thank you. Thank you very much.
The next day, Dylan Roof walked into an all-black church in Charleston, South Carolina, during a Bible study. They welcomed him into their prayer circle. And then he opened fire with a handgun, killing 9 people. Roof had posted a manifesto online outlining his beliefs. It was shared all over Reddit and 4chan. Parts of it had been cribbed directly from racist message boards. And he named the Council of Conservative Citizens, with its website full of black-on-white crime statistics, as a direct inspiration. A spokesman for the council said they condemned the violence. "We put forward information," he said. "What he did with this information is his responsibility." This was a tactic the white supremacist movement had been using since the 90s. They could influence people to violence for the cause without ever meeting them. And then they could distance themselves from the heinous acts of terrorism they inspired. Like Oklahoma City bomber Tim McVeigh, Roof was seen as a lone wolf, rather than a member of a hate movement that had been growing online. A young movement, just discovering its power to spread conspiracy, to influence politics, and to turn the violence it spewed online to violent action in the streets. I'm Garrett Graff, and this is Long Shadow: Rise of the American Far Right. Episode 6: American Carnage.
Bold, brash, and never bashful, the Donald now makes his voice loud and clear every Monday on Fox.
My message is a better message than anybody else.
Monday mornings with Trump on Fox and Friends.
With everything that's happened over the last decade, you might have forgotten that the political character of Donald Trump was invented by Fox News. Ever since March of 2011, Donald Trump hosted a weekly segment on Fox News' Fox and Friends called Monday Mornings with Trump.
If it's Monday at 7 a.m. Eastern, what does that usually mean?
Well, it means good ratings. That's what it means.
You're sure right about that. Thanks to you.
Yeah.
At the time, Trump was becoming popular because of his birther conspiracy, calling into question where then-President Barack Obama was really born.
This guy either has a birth certificate or he doesn't.
That made him popular with a Republican base across the country. So every week on Monday Mornings with Trump, he was given free rein to talk about whatever popped into his head. He used the segments to spread his lies and express his racism.
These 2 animals that shot the cops. And, you don't see rioting when the cops get shot.
Nope.
Trump had long had his finger on the pulse of middle America. He'd become well known as a real estate mogul, then as a reality star.
Do you think I want to hire somebody that's white trash? No. Derek, you're fired.
And as an occasional guest on WrestleMania.
The hostile takeover of Donald Trump!
He had a knack for the tastes of the everyman. But on Fox and Friends, he was given a platform to hone his political voice. Politically incorrect, unapologetic, and tough on crime.
These 2 people are just gunned down by these 2 thugs, and they should get the death penalty, absolutely.
The ratings spoke for themselves. All across America, people were tuning in.
The press is going to be talking about that Donald Trump is still considering getting into the race for president.
I'd rather not do that. I'd rather not even be talking about it.
After a brief unsuccessful foray as a candidate in the 2012 election, Trump set his sights on 2016. And with his continued appearances, Fox News helped drive his popularity to new heights.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the next President of the United States, Donald J. Trump.
By the fall of 2015, Donald Trump's run for the presidency was in high gear.
Wow, look at this crowd.
Right off the bat, he understood optics. He held massive rally after massive rally all over the country.
We have by far the biggest crowds, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina. We have crowds. Nobody has crowds like we have crowds.
And Fox News would broadcast these rallies without commentary, providing a massive national platform. Soon, all the other major news outlets were doing the same to keep up with the ratings. Democrat or Republican, Trump's speeches were a train wreck you just had to watch. Night after night, in primetime, he ranted and raved to a thrilled audience about whatever he wanted. Tirades about the threat of Islam.
Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until our country's representatives can figure out what the hell is going on. I want surveillance of certain mosques, okay? If that's okay.
Or his plans for the country's immigrants.
We have some bad hombres here, and we're going to get them out.
Build a wall! We're going to build a wall! We're going to build a wall!
His unfiltered, unpolitically correct rhetoric made Trump popular with those on the right fed up with the so-called woke movement of the Obama era. He was a candidate built for the 21st century, someone who tweeted on average 22 times a day. And although he seemed careless with his words, much of what he said was short, catchy, and begging to be turned into a meme. You know, those images with words on them that spread like wildfire on the internet, get shared by your crazy uncle on Facebook, and forwarded in emails in endless strings of dubious provenance. With his patented 3 or 4 word catchphrases, Donald Trump quickly became the king of memes.
Build the wall, drain the swamp.
Joan Donovan, again.
He makes memes as promises or policy.
And we're going to drain the swamp. Drain the swamp in Washington, D.C.
Moments where people start chanting.
Those punchy catchphrases stuck in the minds of voters and trended on the internet, shared in thousands of memes. But perhaps the most enduring one was Trump's campaign slogan itself.
Make America great again.
MAGA, when people would ask, what does it mean? On the right, people would say, we want to return to a time when things weren't so complicated.
A time before Black Lives Matter.
You're going to hear it once. All lives matter.
A time when you could say whatever you want, even if it was racist, homophobic, or misogynist.
He says the things that needs to be said, the truth that nobody else says.
They see a person that actually stands for, what they've been thinking in their head, but were too afraid to say all the years.
MAGA was a kind of dog whistle, a quiet promise from Trump to his base.
You'd hear people say, it means make America white again.
Early on, no one gave Trump much of a chance of winning. But right away, he was hugely popular with the denizens of forums like 4chan. In some ways, he was like them, a brashly racist, meme-generating machine.
These weren't people that were your typical Republican voters. They were not a voting bloc at all.
But the influence of white supremacist groups was growing on 4chan, and with it, a newfound interest in politics.
Politics that were very extreme, far right, mostly nihilistic, not necessarily we're going to take over the government, but wouldn't it be great if somebody just burned it all down?
Like a lot of trends on 4chan, support for Trump started as half of a joke. They decided that getting him elected would be the ultimate troll, a finger in the eye of political correctness. 4chan quickly became a staging ground for a massive trolling campaign.
People on 4chan got coordinated and decided that they were going to rattle political opponents of Trump. They felt like if we can embarrass the opposition, we will come out victorious.
In the war on Trump's opponents, memes became weapons. In hundreds of viral images, 4chan users praised Trump and bashed Hillary Clinton.
What 4chan became really good at doing is owning the internet. They could hoax trending topics on Twitter very easily.
They used networks of thousands of fake social media accounts to spread messages they wanted to unleash onto the world, building surprisingly powerful pro-Trump propaganda campaigns. The internet seemed flooded with tweets, posts, and graphics depicting Trump as a strongman hero and Hillary as shrill, corrupt, or straight-up evil.
You could see that people are starting to get activated online because of the sheer force and intensity of the meme war.
You might be asking yourself, so how do a bunch of pictures with words on them end up influencing an election? Remember during the campaign when suddenly there were widespread questions about Clinton's health?
Right-wing groups are pouncing to push the narrative that Hillary Clinton's health is failing.
Conspiracy theories that started in dark corners on the internet spread outward, picked up by people like Alex Jones on InfoWars.
I mean, this woman is dangerous, ladies and gentlemen. I'm telling you, she is a demon.
Some of them even made it to Fox News.
Perhaps Mrs. Clinton is not being entirely straightforward with voters on the true nature of her condition.
And Trump and his team never missed a chance to capitalize on the disinformation.
She also lacks the mental and physical stamina.
The Trump campaign embraced these online fights, understanding that what trended online might just end up on broadcast television. And the trolls who started it were amazed by their newfound power. What began on 4chan as a series of crude political jokes was becoming a far-right movement of its own. And spurred by white supremacists, a new, more serious discussion was happening.
How the far right and even fascism could be a way forward for the United States.
I have actually met some kids from 4chan who started reading anything critical of race relations, immigration, Jewish influence, so on, so that they could troll people. You know, it's like, oh, I want to get these arguments so that I can really piss people off.
Right.
That was their entrance to it, but after reading it, they were actually convinced by it.
This is Richard Spencer. Essentially, Spencer is a shiny new package for a lot of old white power ideas. He believes in the creation of an all-white ethno-state, free of Jews and minorities. And as Donald Trump campaigned for the presidency, Spencer was one of the people rallying the trolls of 4chan. He'd popularized the name for this new far-right movement of internet-savvy extremists, the alternative right, or alt-right.
This rising faction of Gen Z and millennials who believe that diversity in the United States has gone wrong, that diversity is the reason why there is government dysfunction. Diversity is the reason why young white men are not thriving in the United States.
The grievances of the alt-right weren't new, but its reach into a massive young demographic online was alarming. What had started as a joke was becoming a concerning new hate movement.
We memed alt-right into existence, and it's now almost a household name.
As Trump's unlikely campaign rose and support coalesced around him, it changed the center of gravity in the GOP. Gone was the compassionate conservatism of the Bushes and the veiled economic outrage of the Tea Party. A more open and unapologetic white supremacist faction was moving in. People like Richard Spencer and Steve Bannon.
One former employee describes Bannon this way.
Volatile, angry, driven, aggressive. Steve Bannon is the type of fellow who will step on anyone and over anybody to get to the top.
Bannon had been running Breitbart, a far-right news outlet, when he was named chief executive of Donald Trump's campaign. His appointment was hailed by white supremacists like KKK leader David Duke. Bannon was well aware of what the alt-right memes were doing for the campaign, and he proclaimed Breitbart to be the official platform of the alt-right. Spencer and his army of trolls were thrilled. With time ticking down to Election Day, the alt-right went into overdrive online, and the Trump campaign got a huge break.
WikiLeaks releasing emails it claims are from the Clinton campaign, and we remind you the information may have come to light from unreliable sources. Some are pointing at the Russians.
An elite Russian hacking unit known as Fancy Bear, part of Russia's military intelligence agency, broke into the email account of John Podesta, the chair of Hillary Clinton's campaign. Then, through WikiLeaks, they released 20,000 of Podesta's emails. But even Fox News commentators had to admit there weren't that many bombshells.
This stuff is pretty inoffensive. There's no new crimes here, I think.
The emails revealed all sorts of quasi-embarrassing material, like paid speeches Clinton had given to Wall Street banks, or that a CNN moderator had given Clinton debate questions ahead of time. But the internet trolls of 4chan used the emails in a different way. It would become their most stunning and bewildering contribution to the 2016 campaign.
The White House and Podesta and the DNC ordered a lot of pizza. And in circles on 4chan, CP didn't stand for cheese pizza. It stood for child pornography. From that group of emails spawned the theory of Pizzagate.
Users on 4chan developed a conspiracy theory as a joke, that instead of ordering pizza, Podesta and his staff were using code to order children.
They had this theory that pizza toppings were code for different kinds of children, ages, or races, or genders. It really quickly spun out of control.
The Pizzagate theory went viral, and as it was shared, it continued to develop. Suddenly, a growing group of people believed that a satanic cabal of Democrats, of which Hillary Clinton was a leader, were running a child sex trafficking ring. Pizzagate might have stayed just another conspiracy theory on the internet, but it was picked up by Alex Jones in a video seen hundreds of thousands of times.
When I think about all the children Hillary Clinton has personally murdered and chopped up and raped, I have zero fear standing up against her.
One of the Podesta emails mentioned a fundraiser to be held at a Washington, D.C. pizza place called Comet Ping Pong. Eventually, conspiracy theorists pinpointed that location as the headquarters of the supposed child trafficking ring.
Comet Pizza. Here we go.
Jack Posobiec, who's a well-known right-wing provocateur, goes to the pizza place where they allegedly have a dungeon full of children.
All right, they're taking us into the back now.
He's live streaming it, saying, I don't know where it is. I'm looking for a door to the basement.
It's like there's two doors here, but you couldn't really tell normally.
He's really playing it up.
It wasn't long before Comet Ping Pong was besieged with death threats. And then a man named Edgar Welch decided to make the drive to D.C. to investigate. Welch bursts into Comet Ping Pong with an assault rifle, demanding to be taken to the basement.
And the gun does go off while he's there because he's looking for a basement that doesn't even exist.
No one was hurt. Welch was taken into custody without incident. But it was startling how quickly the conspiracy theory spread and how quickly it had led to violence. It had been a little over a month since the first online mention of Pizzagate. The Pizzagate theory would keep evolving into the QAnon conspiracy theory, a belief similar to the old far-right belief in the New World Order, that a shadowy cabal of liberals was preying on children, and that Donald Trump was recruited by military leaders to put an end to it. According to a poll by the Public Religion Research Institute in 2021, between 15 and 20% of Americans believe in QAnon. There's no way to know for sure how much all of this contributed to the end result of the 2016 election. But the result is indisputable. Donald Trump won.
What a great honor to be able to introduce for the first time ever anywhere the 45th President of the United States of America, Donald J. Trump.
The far right had taken over the Republican Party, and in effect, the country.
People of the world, thank you.
At his inauguration, Trump gave a speech co-written by Steve Bannon. It was a grim look at the state of America and a warning of the days ahead.
And the crime, and the gangs, and the drugs that have stolen too many lives and robbed our country of so much unrealized potential. This American carnage stops right here and stops right now.
Trump's victory was hailed by white supremacists everywhere, and literally hailed by Richard Spencer of the alt-right.
Hail Trump! Hail our people! Hail victory!
Spencer gave a speech to a rapt audience of Nazis who cheered and raised the Nazi salute.
No one will honor us for losing gracefully. No one mourns the great crimes committed against us. For us, it is conquer or die.
Spencer was far from the only racist emboldened by Trump's election. Almost immediately, hate crimes and anti-Semitism spiked.
Swastikas, homophobic insults, graffiti daubed on a church. This is one of more than 400 hate crimes recorded in the United States since the election of Donald Trump.
Some of the perpetrators of these crimes mentioned President Trump directly.
Amber Timmons was on her way to work when she noticed a swastika symbol and the words Trump and die spray painted on her car.
As these hate crimes increased, appointees to Donald Trump's new administration were making their way to D.C.
I came in on February 20th of 2017, so I was a little late.
This is Elizabeth Newman. She would serve as the Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism in the Department of Homeland Security. Newman had worked for DHS under the Bush administration after 9/11 and somewhat reluctantly took a new position under Trump.
My initial focus was catching up on what did I miss, where are we with ISIS. I was very much focused on that international terrorism picture. Very quickly, we had an incident in March of 2017 where there was vandalism on a number of Jewish cemeteries. It was enough to where we started to ask questions. What does this mean? We should probably have a better understanding.
Newman didn't know at the time that a far-right movement that had been festering in America for decades had become supercharged, and it was about to go international.
We had not appreciated how big that movement was.
Ever since Dylan Roof's massacre of black churchgoers in 2015, there had been a movement growing across the country to remove statues honoring the Confederacy. And in the summer of 2017, the parks of Charlottesville, Virginia had become a battleground where social justice groups would square off with the far right.
Today, there's a chapter of the Ku Klux Klan that has come to Charlottesville for a protest at this park that we're standing next to, which was...
The Charlottesville City Council voted to remove a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee from a public park. And alt-right leader Richard Spencer decided that this would be the moment to take his movement from online to the streets.
It was announced that the alt-right were going to be coming to that statue and we're going to be having a big rally.
Joan Donovan was watching discussion about the rally on 4chan and Reddit.
And they had put together a bunch of memes that included actual Nazi symbols. There were discussions about come to the event looking clean, wear nicer clothes, wear khakis and white t-shirts.
The Unite the Right rally, as it came to be called, would draw in far-right white supremacist groups new and old from all over the country. From neo-Nazi terrorist groups like Atomwaffen, to legacy groups like the KKK, to far-right militias like the Oath Keepers. A dozen counter-protest groups planned to attend too, including Black Lives Matter and a handful of anti-fascist groups.
People in the town of Charlottesville did everything they could to try to prevent this from happening. But eventually, it was known amongst everybody that this event was going to happen and that people were going to come from all over the United States to be part of it.
On the night of August 11th, 2017, scores of white men, led by Richard Spencer, marched into the park near the University of Virginia campus.
And they were carrying these torches through the campus of UVA, marching in unison. They all looked alike. They all had nice haircuts. They wanted to look like the heyday of the KKK.
As they surrounded people protesting the Robert E. Lee statue, they shouted, "You will not replace us." It was a nod to the replacement conspiracy theory that said that Jews were conspiring to replace white people with other minorities. The scene quickly exploded into violence, with white supremacists battling anti-fascists at the foot of the statue. The next day, Unite the Right had scheduled a march through the streets of Charlottesville.
Based on what had happened on Friday, that event should have been canceled. It just did not seem like the Charlottesville police were going to at all be able to handle what was going to happen.
Dozens of neo-Nazis, white nationalists, and militiamen gathered in the park, prepared for violence.
They were also bringing weapons, pepper spray and shields and helmets.
The streets immediately devolved into a war zone. Counter-protesters and white supremacists fist-fought and beat each other with clubs and flags. Dozens of people went to the hospital as local police more or less stood by. And then, in the middle of all the bedlam, a neo-Nazi drove his car into a crowd of counter-protesters. "35 people were injured. A 32-year-old counter-protester named Heather Heyer was killed." The attacks at Charlottesville were shocking and drew widespread condemnation from both sides of the political aisle, with one very notable exception.
There was a group on this side, you can call them the left, or you've just called them the left, that came violently attacking the other group. So you can say what you want, but that's the way it is.
Instead of condemning far-right groups and actual white supremacists, he seemed to take this stance that their desire to protect that statue was in the right.
But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
Charlottesville surprised the country. Even people at the Department of Homeland Security like Elizabeth Newman were shocked.
Charlottesville was a huge wake-up call for us, seeing basically neo-Nazis walking down the street of Charlottesville.
What was more surprising, Newman says, is that no one at DHS had been paying attention to the growing threat of white domestic terror.
In the analysis field, it takes years for you to gain an understanding of an enemy and their tactics, their techniques, so that you can look at an event and say, this matters or this doesn't matter. It just turns out there had been nobody working the domestic terrorism beat.
Remember that back in 2009, a memo had leaked from the Department of Homeland Security. A memo that had warned that veterans coming back from wars overseas were likely to be targeted for recruitment by far-right groups. When that memo was scandalized by right-wing media, groups watching domestic terror at DHS had been disbanded in the aftermath. Now, DHS was way behind on a crisis that was already reaching a boiling point.
We really felt like we were in the dark. We are dealing with a major problem, and we do not have the structures in place to be able to properly address it.
Over the next year, while Newman and her team played catch-up, acts of far-right violence kept happening across America. And then, in one especially violent month leading up to the November 2018 midterms, there was a rash of attacks.
This was an unsettling day across this country as we learned of several bombs sent to multiple locations.
16 mail bombs were sent to Democratic politicians like Barack Obama and Joe Biden, as well as CNN.
Authorities calling the bombs acts of terror.
While the manhunt was on for the bomber, a white man in Jefferson, Kentucky, murdered 2 black customers at a grocery store.
2 people are dead and another is in custody after a shooting at a Kroger grocery.
He had tried and failed to enter a black church in the hopes of mimicking Dylan Roof's massacre. 2 days later, the man who had sent all the mail bombs was arrested.
A suspect is under arrest and has been taken by federal authorities.
The bomber was a Florida man named Cesar Sayoc, a bouncer at a strip club. An obsessive viewer of Fox News and an avid fan of President Trump, Sayoc had taken it upon himself to try to kill Trump's enemies. He was dubbed the MAGA bomber, one of the first recorded terrorists to have been directly influenced and radicalized by Donald Trump's words. The next day, a man named Robert Bowers barged into the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh, screaming anti-Semitic slurs. He opened fire, killing 11.
There has been a shooting at a synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Just moments ago, police reporting there are multiple casualties.
The Tree of Life synagogue shooting, whatever questions we had about what is this get answered. Like, this is a problem. We have a massive domestic violent extremism problem, and it is morphing and changing.
Newman and DHS worked on policies to deal with the festering problem of white supremacist terror, but they were getting resistance from the top of the Trump administration.
There was this tension of, we got to do this because it's the right thing, but we need to be savvy in how we do this so we don't get directed that we can't do it. If Trump actually found out what we were doing, he might try to tell us to stop doing it. That was the undercurrent. It just was too close to condemning white supremacists, and they vote for Trump. We don't want to push them too far to the side. So in 2019, I was at a meeting in Malaga, Spain, for a group of countries that had come together to defeat ISIS. There's like 100 countries around this table. We're doing introductions, and we're supposed to explain our top 3 threats. I would say we were halfway around the table, and 90% of the countries talked about the rise of violent right-wing extremism. And I was sitting next to the United Kingdom, and I turned to them and I said, "Are you seeing this? I just thought it was our challenge." He was like, "Oh no, this is a problem for us as well." And it was this real light bulb moment for me. We were not isolated and alone in facing that challenge. The very next morning, I'm getting up early to fly back. I'm getting in the cab to go to the airport, check my phone, and I have just gotten the alert about Christchurch.
The horrific terror attack that unfolded in New Zealand overnight. Not one, but 2 mosques in Christchurch were targeted, the country's worst mass shooting ever.
On March 15, 2019, a 28-year-old white supremacist inspired by Dylan Roof's manifesto charged into 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand during Friday prayers. He live-streamed the massacre online as he killed 51 people and injured 40 more.
Unprecedented is how police are describing this attack. Scores dead, people ran for their lives, but many did not make it.
The shooter posted a manifesto of his own online, which he called the Great Replacement. Another reference to that conspiracy theory that Jews and immigrants were intent on wiping out the white race. He wrote that he hoped his massacre would inspire civil war in the United States.
I remember sitting in the cab going, "Oh my God, we're too late. This is metastasized, and the United States is a major exporter of this ideology."
The clock was ticking down until the next major attack, but the Trump administration was still uninterested. They refused to join the Christchurch call, an effort pushing social media companies to do more about radicalization on their platforms. But quietly, Newman and her team at DHS worked on other policy changes.
We continued working, trying to put together the infrastructure to address this threat. Nobody's telling us to stop, but we need to be a little sophisticated in how we address this, and don't think about asking the president to actually help you with anything, because that's likely to result in a backlash and get you shut down.
On August 3rd, 2019, the inevitable happened.
Here in El Paso tonight, a gunman showing up at a Walmart armed with an assault-style rifle.
A 21-year-old walked into a Walmart in El Paso, Texas, and opened fire on Hispanic shoppers.
Terrified families, their hands up in the air, running for their lives past armed police.
The gunman killed 23 and injured another 23 before he was taken into custody. In a manifesto he posted on the internet too, the shooter said he'd been inspired by the Christchurch massacre to carry out his own attack.
To have the El Paso attack on a Saturday at a Walmart where kids are getting ready to go back to school, like, it just pierced the American conscience.
It was one of the deadliest attacks carried out on Latinos in modern American history, and many across the country demanded action.
The pressure on the Department of Homeland Security to do something coming from the White House was pretty significant. They were like, we need to show action. So it created openings for us to actually serve up some policy proposals. It was like 3 weeks of not sleeping because we were trying to get things up to the Hill.
White supremacists had inspired Dylann Roof. Dylann Roof had inspired the Christchurch shooting. The Christchurch shooting had inspired the El Paso shooting. But the federal government was still making the same mistakes it had made after the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. It viewed each of these massacres as lone wolf attacks, not connected to a larger movement. And there was resistance on the part of the Trump White House to call these attacks what they were.
They had to frame it as, so we're going to brief the president that we have a plan in place to do more violence prevention, and that's what we're going to need to call it, is violence prevention. And I looked at them and I was like, if that's what you need to call it so that we can get the money, I'm fine with that. I just need to be clear that my boss and I will be calling this domestic terrorism because that is what it is.
Throughout this process, Newman was becoming more and more frustrated. The problem of far-right domestic terror was festering, and the Trump administration refused to address it. In early 2020, Newman and other DHS and FBI officials attended a congressional hearing called Confronting the Rise in Anti-Semitic Domestic Terrorism.
Would you agree that one of the most significant threats we face today when it comes to terrorism is that of a self-radicalized lone gunman, lone gunwoman, or lone perpetrator who hasn't traveled to a terrorist camp, hasn't necessarily even moved overseas?
Correct. The lone offender is our greatest threat.
And they're often radicalized online, correct?
I knew I was on my way out the door, and I had prepared and left it off of the script, meaning the script that got approved, a section that would try to send the signal, we are not properly prepared for this. I've really struggled with this, several of the questions you've been raising, Mr. Chairman, and I've, in truth, been struggling with this for the 2 years that I've been in my position. The national security apparatus is designed for a threat from 20, 30 years ago. We do not have the systems in place. The warning signs are there. The world is changing, and every counterterrorism professional I speak to in the federal government and overseas feels like we are at the doorstep of another 9/11, maybe not something that catastrophic in terms of the visual or the numbers, but that we can see it building and we don't quite know how to stop it. Somebody should go and study it. Before we're responding to the attack, wouldn't it be great if we actually prepared in advance for the enemy that we know is coming? And that did make some headlines, but it was also 2, 3, 4 weeks before COVID shutdowns started.
Now to growing concerns about the deadly coronavirus officially hitting the U.S. Here's what we know.
And it really was lost in the shuffle of all of the other priorities at the time.
The COVID-19 pandemic would soon absorb the attention and resources of the U.S. government and the world.
I was with my prevention team, and I said, there is a strong likelihood that we're all going to be shut down for a while. What does this do to society? The answer was we should expect, upon reopening, to see more attacks because, yes, this will drive people to violence.
The pandemic would inflame the anti-government sentiment that had been building for 40 years.
Stop to the New World Order!
It would confirm the fears of many on the far right that the government was tyrannical and trying to control the citizenry. And as these sentiments caught fire, violence would erupt in the streets of America. And the federal government would be so busy putting out all these fires that they wouldn't see what was coming.
They were not looking at what might happen several months or years down the road.
For decades, the far right had lurked in the shadows. Now it was time to strike. That's on the final episode of Long Shadow, Rise of the American Far Right. If you want to know more about the online far-right movement that helped elect President Trump, check out Meme Wars, the untold story of the online battles upending democracy in America, by Joan Donovan, Emily Dreyfus, and Brian Friedberg. Long Shadow: Rise of the American Far Right is a co-production of Longlead and Campside Media. The show is produced by Ryan Swikert. Callie Hitchcock is our associate producer. Executive producers are John Patrick Pullen and Josh Dean, who also serve as Long Shadow's story editors. Audience development by Heather Muse. Will DeGravio is our research assistant. Fact-checking by Rebecca Holland. Claire Mullen did the mix and sound design by Ryan Swikert. Music by Blue Dot Sessions and APM. Cover art by Longlead's creative director, Sarah Rogers. A special thanks to Jennifer Bassett, who consulted on the podcast. Learn more about Longlead and subscribe to our newsletter at longlead.com. If you're enjoying the show, spread the word and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find the show. I'm Garrett Graff, and thanks for listening.